It's Kevin Rudd here, and I'm here in the ABC studios in Sydney. I'm your guest presenter here this evening. There's been something of a coup at the ABC. I'm your guest presenter this evening, and my special guest in this evening's studio is Phillip Adams.
Excuse me, how come you're here in my little monk cell?
Well, earlier this evening, Phillip, I was invited here to the ABC to launch a book. But because you can't launch books at the ABC, instead I unleashed it.
Oh, right.
That book is entitled Bedtime Stories, Tales from My 21 Years at Radio National's Late Night Live, author Phillip Adams.
Oh, I see. Well, did you say anything nice about me?
In the remarks,
Yes.
they have been put fully into the ABC Hansard, and the drafts will be corrected later.
In that case, I surrender to you. I am putty in your hands.
Well, this must be a unique experience for you, because it certainly is for me. Now, Phillip, as I've actually spent some time reading Bedtime Stories. It's been out for a little while, and I can only say that it reads to me like almost a love letter to the wireless. You are infatuated with the medium. Tell me how you feel about the texture of the wireless.
I think all these other things are passing fads, Kevin. I mean, clearly the newspaper is in its dotage. Cinema attendances are collapsing all over the world. I think the wireless will survive like the cockroach after nuclear war. It'll always be around, wireless. And it's so intimate. It's not really broadcasting. It's a very narrow casting way of communicating with people, which is why, as you know, I call the listener Gladys.
I've read about Gladys and the I Am Gladys badges that were printed in those days when it looked as if John Winston Howard was going to take the guillotine out into the Place de la Concorde here in Sydney and behead the ABC. Then you organised all those gladdies across the country to stop the event from happening.
Yes, and to my astonishment, when we got to the Perth Town Hall, which is a large venue, which we managed to stack to the rafters, a bit like branch stacking in the ALP.
These things don't happen, and you know that.
And everyone had badges saying, I am Gladys, a bit like I am Spartacus, I suppose. It was a great night. I should also point out that at the time I wasn't allowed to say Gladys because it was a joke about low ratings and the ABC felt that it was inappropriate. Just as later, and very rarely have I been censored at this place, but I was censored a little later because I had a habit of describing John Winston Howard as Mr. Magoo. And I thought, how could anyone object to that? Because Mr. Magoo was a very lovable character.
I watched Mr. Magoo as a kid. I rather liked him.
Yes, he'd blundering around.
In fact, he always drove that car of his in places that he shouldn't.
And he would have long, intimate conversations with fire hydrants.
He did, and had remarkable adaptability to the 21st century, like others in our lives that you've reflected on. Going back to the medium, the wireless, and why you think it will prevail, why radio will prevail, as other communications media begin to ebb.
Television, passing fad.
In the book, you talk a lot about the absolute power of conversation as a way of learning, as a way of exploring ideas, as opposed to what you say that you inherited in the original Radio National format or from other programs like it, which were more like delivering public lectures. Explain to me how you undertook the evolution into the style of the conversation.
Well, first of all, as you know, there's about 100 ways to conduct an interview. They can be interrogations, they can be traps, they can be thuggery, really. Certain shock jocks come to mind. But I've always found that a good-humoured, civilised conversation, where it's first-name terms, and that's been a house rule, incidentally, on the program from day one. So even if His Holiness came on, I'd have to call him by his first name, and if the Dalai Lama came on, I'd be calling him Dalai. So you settle people down, you make them relaxed, you try and get some sort of joke up so there's a smile, and then you quietly converse. And I think you get so much more out of that, Kevin, than you do out of any of the interrogation strategies which are more commonly employed. Of course, this is unrehearsed, unscripted. Very often I'm talking to someone who isn't there. I mean, you're there, I can actually see you, but normally I've just got voices in the headphone. So you've got no visual cues on whether the listener is thinking or indeed has died. I'm sorry, the guest is thinking or has passed away.
That would be pretty disconcerting if that actually happened. What I've always liked about your interviewing style is this, that through intelligent conversation, you try and dig for the idea behind the idea, or the idea behind the assertion. And it's often said in the contemporary media space, there's so little opportunity and time to do that. I've also heard you on air interview people where there's a long pause, and then you'll have an absolute perler of a response. And then other interviews where there's even a longer pause, and you discover that in fact there was nothing behind the idea in the first place.
Well, that so-called dead time is a great problem. I interrogated, conversed in his own home with Pierre Rickman, who was one of the most fastidious and elegant people I know, and a great scholar of China, as you know. He invited me, he wanted to do it, but he hated being talked to on the wireless because, as he said, it takes me sometimes a day to write a paragraph, and you're expecting me to write a paragraph now, as we sit here. And so that interview, when I brought it back to Sydney from Canberra, was full of the most incredible silences. Now, to me, they were delicious because here was someone who was absolutely thinking deeply about his response. Were a show pony like a Gore Vidal or indeed my old friend Christopher Hitchens. Never fall silent for a nanosecond because they're performance pieces. But when you've got a guest like Pierre Rickman, who is deeply thoughtful, those silences are precious, and we shouldn't be afraid of them. We had to, in fact, abbreviate his silences because...
You didn't censor his silences, did you?
I'm afraid we did.
Phillip, the ABC did those sort of things. I admire Rickman's enormously. I think he's one of our greatest and arguably least known Australian public intellectuals.
Well, he was one of your teachers, as I remember him shyly confessing.
Well, I'm a little biased on these questions because I had the singular joy, actually, of sitting in Pierre's classes in second and third and fourth year Chinese studies at the Australian National University, and just brilliant. His knowledge of classical Chinese, his knowledge of Chinese aesthetics, painting and calligraphy is right out there with the world's greatest experts. But the idea of interviewing him, I think I would find just daunting. At the end of each class, we as slightly acneous undergraduates would emerge feeling enthralled, inspired, and totally intimidated that those were the standards which lay ahead of us.
I know that this is your program and I'm just here as a guest, but what got you interested in studying Chinese?
My mum, God bless her soul, when I was a kid growing up on our farm at Yamundi, thought that I should widen my horizons, and so she bought me a book one day on archaeology. I know you have a passion for the ancients, for the ancient Mesopotamians and the Greeks and the rest. Well, this book on ancient archaeology did the classic tour across the Western schools, but then tucked right up the back was a couple of pages on Chinese archaeology. And I just remember as a kid looking at these forms and shapes and thinking, that's rather beaut. It's rather different from everything else. I'd like to know more about that. And if you like, that was spark number one. And then as I progressed into high school, Gough quite rashly went to China. Billy McMahon said that Chinese communists played him like a trout, I think. And as I watched on TV, Gough meeting the great and the good and the not so good in China in the early 70s, I thought, I want to be part of that. But on the great Rickman's discourse, because I'm interviewing you and you're not interviewing me.
Sorry.
When you interview folk like that who are just genuinely brilliant in their field, do you ever get to the stage yourself in interviewing such formidable minds that you don't quite know where to take the conversation? Because
I'm afraid the answer to that is no. I'm consumed with curiosity. One of the reasons this is the best job in media in Australia, and I think many people would share that view, the queue for people who want to do my job is very long. Bob Carr, in fact, used to put his hand up. It was always his ambition to be the
So
presenter.
Bob got my job, but he actually
understand.
wanted
He
yours
wanted
all
mine,
along.
yeah.
Well,
But
one of life's little ironies.
here's an opportunity to talk to just about anyone on earth about any subject. So we touch lightly, brush over every imaginable topic, theology, science, philosophy, you name it, we do it. But the only topic we rarely touch is sport. I know you are passionate about your sport, but I'm not all that enthusiastic. So my job is easy. I only have to ask, not answer. And I think that basically a trained chimpanzee could do what I do.
But you've got to follow the thread of the argument and where some of these formidable minds take you. Of all the folk that you've interviewed, and this question will sound facile, but who do you rank up there amongst the great and the good? And in those interviews that you've had with them, which of their ideas or ways of understanding the world have actually had an effect on you, Phillip Adams, the person?
An impossible question. First of all, I have to say that the great joy to me is not landing a big fish like one of your colleagues, Henry Kissinger, or indeed the aforementioned Vidal, or any of the the really lofty people, Gorbachev et al., that I've had on the program. It's the surprise. It's when you find yourself talking to a young scholar or an activist or someone who's just written their first and perhaps only book with a burning idea or a new idea to them, and they come on the program and they're often quite nervous. They're often a bit awed by all the technology around them, and they come alight, and you get that little frisson as you sort of respond to them. And that's one of the obligations of the program. We don't talk to that many celebrities. We really don't. We cast a very wide net, and we try to find people at that moment of intellectual enlightenment where their own lives are being transformed in the hope of passing it on. So no, I can't name a guest or an interview. Ongoing relationships. I mean, Hitchens was on, I think, the first program, and Christopher, then absolutely unfamous, was our voice from America. And the relationship I had with Hitchens over the years was enthralling. We fell out over a certain political misadventure in the Middle East, but we had a rapprochement afterwards because on everything else he was just electrifying. One of the great literary critics, I remember he wrote an essay once on Anthony Poll's novels, Dance to the Music of Time, which I think is one of the greatest pieces of literary criticism I've ever read. So I'm dealing with this extraordinary mind, and no matter how early in the morning we'd wake him up and how pissed he was from the last night, because as you know he had Johnny Walker Black Label on a drip feed, he'd always be dazzling. And I think he's probably the cleverest person I've had on over the years. Not the most profound, but certainly the cleverest.
What is good about the program in the Australian debate on ideas is the democracy of ideas that seems to underline the philosophy of your program. I've actually looked through the list of the folk that you have interviewed, and there's half of these names I've never heard of in my life. But
we hadn't heard of you when you came on. I should point out that our relationship began when you appeared on this program, when you were just emerging from your chrysalis as a bureaucrat in Queensland to become a politician. I'd never heard of you, and you were just voicing the headphones, and as I came off here I said, who the hell was that? Someone said it was Kevin Rudd. I said, he's going to go a long way, that lad. Well, I was wrong about that, but
that's true.
It could have happened.
Oh, that's right. You stuffed up there, mate. But yes, that was back in the Mesolithic period of my own career. And but on the question of the democratisation of ideas, my earlier remarks tonight in the unleashing, not launching. We don't launch at the ABC of your book. I likened you to a secular Jesuit, and that is someone who's quite passionate about the evangelisation of the mind. And I think there's something in that about you. You're not proselytising a particular corpus of ideas, but my experience of you is that what you want above all else is to develop, preserve, and to prod into continued life and existence and intellectual culture in this country. That, I think, has been a good thing to do. And on the Jesuit theme, I don't know if you've heard of the guy who's the current Superior General of the Jesuits in Rome, but I went and saw the bloke.
We'll book him. We'll get him on.
You know.
Producers, make a note. Get on.
That's right,
Does he
yeah.
speak English?
Not entirely. No, he does. They're bright blokes. So I rock into his office a couple of years ago. This is the time of the canonisation of Mary MacKillop, because I'm in Rome representing the government. I go and see with my good friend Frank Brennan, the head of the Jesuits there, and I ask what in retrospect would probably be seen to be a massively pompous question, which was, tell me, Superior General, what do you regard the greatest challenge of humankind today? You're talking to the head of the Jesuits. There's 20,000 of them around the world. They're a bright bunch. They've been around for 500 years. They've seen a few things. He had this great response, which goes to the point we've just been discussing.
The Jesuits were the world's great authorities on earthquakes and volcanoes.
Among other things, genuine polymaths. His answer was, the greatest challenge of our time, and he looked at me with the fixed gaze and a high degree of tenderness and said, the great challenge of our time is this, the globalisation of superficiality.
What a zinger. What a zinger.
Well, it was. I mean, it's a phrase which is his, and I think it cuts to the core of much of the public discourse in our country and in the broader West today. And going back to this program, the democratisation and the evangelisation of ideas. Do you find here in Auntie, that is the ABC, that the manifest destiny of this program is always welcome in the broad, rambunctious culture that is the ABC?
I have a great many enemies, and I won't bother naming them, but they're known to you as well, and I'm rather proud of them. But overwhelmingly, the people that listen to this program choose to listen to it, not out of the sort of hostility that I think attracts many listeners to an Alan Jones, because they like ideas too. And the last time I saw a survey of the listener, of the Gladdies, about 70% of them were tertiary educated. Now that's phenomenal. That I've probably got the best educated audience in the country, which is all the more remarkable because I left school when I was 15.
That was to become a comm, though, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. My first job in journalism was I was a writer for the Communist Guardian.
Have we still got your files?
Well, ASIO always denied having them, but when I was giving a speech at the National Archives a couple of years ago, they finally gave me my file.
Really?
And I was thrilled to find that they'd started it when I was 16 years old.
Well, that's when people are at their most dangerous. And I just, hope you've learned to behave yourself since.
I have since. As you know, I've become ultra-conservative and right-wing because, one's got to be aware of bias. Have people ever accused you of having pro-Labor bias? I get this a lot.
From time to time, probably 30 years ago since I joined the Labor Party, I've been accused of that. But you see, this whole subject, which you dedicated, I think, a large part of your life to, which is the prosecution of a debate about ideas for the country's future. Good, bad, indifferent, right, left, Calathumpian, whatever. Of course, in this country, Australia, there's almost a counterculture which says that any debate about ideas is by definition pretentious. I remember that very much at the time when we convened the 2020 summit in 2008. That
was fun. I did enjoy that.
The very notion that you could have a National Ideas Fest for a couple of days where I simply said, okay, here's the country, think about it and what we want to be like in 2020. What are your best ideas?
But the counterattack was from the hard right, wasn't it? From the pundits and the shock jocks.
By and large.
Yeah.
But I think the enduring need of the country, and I like your reflection on this because you know who thinks and writes best in this country better than I, is that in terms of preserving the sinews of a strong intellectual debate, and I'm not talking here of the left, I'm talking about left and right, as opposed to just people who take out the megaphone, where do you think it's going?
Well, 90% of the stories we do are not in any way political, and it's a farce to suggest they are. They're ideas, and I agree with you. Ideas come from all over the spectrum. In fact, I remember a glorious era in Australian politics before 1975, when you could get bipartisan support for the good ideas in the country, when there was a mutuality of respect across the House. There really was, where people on that side would join with people on that side to change the attitude, say, to white Australia, or to homosexual law reform, or to censorship. That's gone. That's gone, and I think that's a tragedy. It's like what poor Obama is facing at the moment, this riven, divided sort of country. And of course, most of our popular culture, the lamestream media, if you look at it, is in fact pouring petrol on embers of discontent. Everything is sloganised, everything is reductive, everything is ugly and abusive, and I think that's bad.
Well, I think it takes two to tango and all of that, and we in the political process have a large role to play in all that. I agree with you in the general comment that the notion that the nation could come together and pull together on stuff that's really important now becomes a bit more remote in Australian politics, and it should be. Can I sustain our line of questioning about your Jesuitical tendencies? What I'm really attracted to, having read this book, and what I've heard from previous discussions with you, is how passionate you are about attending to your correspondence, and that you get letters and emails from all those gladdies now listening to this program, and it's saying quietly to themselves, we want to hear from Phillip, not from Kevin. But you actually answer each and every one of these. You say in your book that this is, for you, a genuine privilege, and I don't think that's just a political line, because I've spoken to you a bit about this over the years.
Well,
tell me about your apostolic role in responding to these letters.
Well, some years ago, the National Library rather foolishly asked if I'd give them my papers, and I said, well, you don't want them. There's so many. And they sent a lieutenant up to the farm where there was just boxes and boxes all mouldering away in the shearing shed, which I know you remember. And, the rats and the white ants and God knows what were getting at them. He said, all right, this will be fine. So there are now 500 or 600 boxes of correspondence in the National Library. Every letter I received and every letter I answered over almost half a century. And it is archaeological because people write to a total stranger and reveal their innermost thoughts and innermost feelings. And often, one letter becomes 100. And some of my correspondents have grown old and died, but I always answered their letters. Letters have now evaporated.
Can I probe, though, why? I find it respectful, I find it Edwardian, I seek to do so myself, and I often fail, and you must get a truckload. So tell me something about the ethos you do that. Is something that you find personally replenishing out of that?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you find the correspondence a bit lonely in terms of you being the font of all evil, font of all knowledge?
There's something about a letter, a handwritten envelope with a stamp on it, that no email, I'm afraid, can ever have. You open it up and out comes this object. And it's got a name on the end. I mean, this is a person talking to me, for heaven's sake. How could I not answer? And in the beginning, it wasn't much of a problem. I didn't get many letters. Towards the end of the letter era, I had 3 full-time secretaries transcribing, because I never wrote a word for 40 years. I didn't write anything. I dictated columns, speeches, scripts, whatever. So I'd sit there and I'd just dictate replies to all the letters. I even managed to reply to anonymous letters, Kevin, and this would amuse you, because people would write me vile, terrible letters, anonymous, but out of force of habit they put their name and address on the envelope.
I like one of the lines from your book, by the way, where you say, I still enjoy a nicely written death threat. I think that's quite a nice thing. You're saying so long as the grammar and the expression is up to it.
No, I do prefer my death threats to be elegantly expressed rather than thuggish. These days, of course, it's the instantaneous response of email, and I try to do that well. But it's the letter that, to me, had the magic and still does. And God knows, one of these days the National Library will have to take them all to just make them into landfill, because they're not catalogued, they're not sorted. They're just an outpouring.
Social historians of the 21st century will thank you as the written records of our age in terms of what people think and feel. slowly slide into a digital morass.
A digital morass, how about that? Okay, look...
I understand you've got an interview coming
Yes,
up.
look, you'd be interested, just before I let you go, or you let me go, Melbourne Cup, Washington Cup tomorrow, are you going for Barack Caviar, or are you going for Storm and Norman?
Well, I know Barack reasonably well. He's a good man. I've only met Governor Romney once. So leaving aside what you want to happen, based on the conversations I had tonight with friends of mine on the ground in a campaign in Virginia, I think it's more probable than not that President Obama will have 4 more years.
Mind you, you and he had a very strong friendship. It was almost like that of John Howard and George W. was in A Virgin on the Consenting Adult.
He's a good man, and a lot of folk don't quite get him in his complexity. Well, Phillip Adams, I
Thank
know
you.
as the interviewer, I'm supposed to wind up this section because listeners, Late Night Live listeners, Gladdies one and all, there is a riveting interview about to happen with an author of a new biography of Brigham Young, the second founder of Mormonism in the United States, and I'm told it's a worthwhile read. Phillip Adams, thank you very much for being on the program. I enjoy your romance of the wireless. I enjoy your romance of correspondence. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Mr. Rudd.
RN, your world unfolding.